Today I'm Walter, and I'm back again with another interview today with Lindsay Moran, who is a former CIA operative, which is very interesting. You're also the author of Blowing My Cover, and you have bylines in Huffington Post, New York Times, Washington Post, and been a lecturer at numerous universities. And I'm glad that you took the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And how are you doing before we jump into everything?
I'm pretty good. It's a beautiful day here on the East Coast, and so I have nothing to complain about. My three dogs are being quiet for this interview, so we'll see how long it
That's good. And and I guess one of the interesting things we can get into, what can you share about your time as a CIA operative? Is that covered in your novel at all, or how does that
Sure,
your
I can
details
talk
of
about
that?
that. Well, it was covered in my book, which is a memoir. Um, and in the book, I spoke about, I would say, almost all that I could speak about, obviously, or wrote about almost all that I could write about. I had to have Blowing My Cover cleared by the Central Intelligence Agency.
Hmm.
Uh, and that holds true for anyone who works at the CIA, that if you're ever going to write about your career there, even any intelligence matters, even if I had written a fictional book, I still would have had to have that cleared by the CIA. Um, and that was a bit of a process, but I will say that at the end of the day, I could count on both hands the number of words that the agency asked me to change. There was very little that I had to take out of my book. So I was very fortunate. But with Blowing My Cover, what I really wanted to do was to put a human face on what it is to be an operations officer, which is kind of the technical name for what most people probably commonly think of as a spy. Um, in CIA parlance, we called ourselves operations officers or case officers. And we all have these ideas of what a spy does that come from, James Bond and Jason Bourne and that whole tradition. And I really wanted to show the real human side of it and what it's really like, which is not as exciting as the Bond and Bourne movies, but it's a lot funnier and a lot more relevant.
And I guess that leads to a question: what led you in that career path? Because that's not something you run across every day. I have in my field of journalism, but how I think that's would be interesting for some listeners to get a little insight on how does one get into that field, or what mindset drives you to become an operative for the CIA.
For me, it had been really a childhood dream. Ever since I was a little girl, I was obsessed with this character, Harriet the Spy, and read those books and kind of fashioned my young life after Harriet the Spy. Was a little sneaky and subversive and spied on my parents and my brother and the neighbors and whoever else there was to spy on. Um, and really, that kind of fascination never went away. And as a teenager or a preteen, as a teenager, I'd go to all the Bond movies. And I grew up in the DC area. And my father did top secret work, not for the Central Intelligence Agency, but for the US Navy. So I grew up in an area and in a household that was really steeped in secrecy and national security. It felt like part of my bloodline. I had always suspected that my grandfather worked for the precursor to the CIA, the OSS, and I to this day I don't know. So for me, actually joining the CIA and becoming part of the clandestine service was really kind of the realization of a childhood dream.
Yes, and I would also assume that your dad's work was nothing like NCIS.
No, not at all. He designed ships
Okay.
for the Navy. He was a naval architect. So when I would call his office when I was young, they would answer, "This is a non-secure line," and I wasn't allowed in to see the work that he was doing. But he did tell me he worked at a lab in Maryland. Where the Navy does a lot of research. And when Alec Baldwin was preparing for his role in The Hunt for Red October, he came to visit the
Oh, nice.
lab. My dad said he acted kind of like a jerk and walked around with a riding crop, which has no bearing on that particular role. But the lab, has like a huge towing tank, and that's where they research and test all of the Navy ships and nuclear subs and all of that.
Okay, that's very interesting. And how did that? Is that how the CIA is how that you got involved with the anti-trafficking movement and working against human trafficking that is a lot bigger problem than it seems like it gets talked about.
Well, there is a connection there. I'm the first one to admit that when I joined the CIA, I had a kind of a naive idea that I was going to be, living undercover and scaling walls in a black cat suit and blowing up safes. And of course, the reality is far different. But the overall motivation for me was I wanted to serve my country. I was very patriotic and I wanted to serve my country. And the agency presented to me this opportunity both to serve my country but not join the military because that would definitely not have been the right fit for me. So to serve my country but do it in this way that was super exciting and sexy and interesting, and kind of the larger cause, like any maybe young boy or girl in America, was like I wanted to fight bad guys. That I my whole life I think have been driven by a strong desire to see justice enacted and to, for lack of a better way to put it, to fight evil. Uh, that's the CIA is not really the place for someone who wants to do that because we're not really fighting the bad guys. We're more recruiting the bad guys. And sometimes they're not even bad guys. We're looking out for our country. What are the best strategic, military, economic interests of the United States of America? And that's what we're fighting for. That's what we're collecting intelligence for. And as I have gotten older, I feel like I've become, less of an American and more of a global citizen and more motivated by global causes and causes of human rights, which the CIA is not particularly well known for. But to get to the trafficking issue, my area of expertise was in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, and I was there in the late 90s and early 2000s. And one of the first things that I saw there, not related necessarily to my CIA work, but was the prevalence of human trafficking. At that time, the economic reality of Eastern Europe and countries like Albania and Macedonia and former Soviet states, there was not a lot of opportunity for any citizens over there. And people were ripe for exploitation, particularly in the arena of sex trafficking for young women and girls, and also labor trafficking for men. And boys can also be victims of labor and sex trafficking. And I saw this and it really bothered me. And, I started to make a bit of a to-do about it within the CIA. And quite frankly, human trafficking and particularly sex trafficking is really not of interest to the Central Intelligence Agency. There are no intelligence directives to collect intelligence on human trafficking. Sure, you might see an intersection between global terrorism and money laundering, and of course you see an intersection between that and sex trafficking and drug trafficking. But really, the focus of the Central Intelligence Agency was not to gather intelligence on people who were being trafficked. And quite frankly, one thing that I saw overseas, and I think you see this in a lot of countries that don't have the same standard of living as the United States, is that a lot of our U.S. Contractors, military personnel, people from the intelligence community were frequenting clubs where there were trafficked women. And, this is something sometimes I would bring up in meetings and internal channels. And again, it was kind of like turn a blind eye to it. Not to say that the agency or the intelligence community was advocating sex trafficking or didn't think it was a bad thing, but it just wasn't something they were fighting against. So it was an issue that always bothered me. And I felt troubled by the fact that here I am out fighting bad guys and people who I think are really bad guys. Like I can't even fight those guys, and I can't even collect intelligence on them, which was my job to collect intelligence or recruit foreign agents. So this issue of human trafficking, it always was kind of at the back of my mind. And fast forward many years, and by this time I was involved in nonprofit advocacy and communications work, and I stumbled upon through my former CIA network. Nick McKinley is the executive director of an organization called Deliver Fund. And I looked at Deliver Fund and what they do and the kind of personnel that makes up the organization. And I really had never seen anything like it before, because it's an organization that fights human trafficking, but with the same kind of tactics and paradigms that many of us use to fight the global war on terror. And I think that's largely because Nick's former CIA himself. We have a lot of former alphabet soup folks. And so these are people who have taken some of the tactics, the technology, frankly, the team members that we use to fight the global war on terror and apply of human trafficking. And so I saw there a real opportunity to make a difference in the way that I like to make a difference. So I called Nick, or got in touch with Nick, and said, hey, I'm Lindsay Moran. I'm a former CIA operative. Let's have a discussion. And once he told me a little bit more about what Deliver Fund does, I asked him, what do you need? What I'd love to help. What do you need? And Nick was looking for someone to help raise money for the organization in the DC area. And I said, I've never done development work, but I am a former CIA operative. I have convinced people to commit espionage, so maybe I can convince some people to put some money to a good cause.
Yeah, that man, you said so many interesting things there, and I guess one of the thing that sticks out immediately is when you were in the Balkans. And again, you definitely don't have to say exactly where and what point. Did the, I guess, your, well, say, colleagues, were they aware that the women at these places were trafficked, or were they under the impression it was a consensual decision they were making, or what impression did they give you on that?
Yeah. That's something that's difficult to say. I don't know what they were aware of. Certainly I would talk about this both in official channels and indirectly, with male friends of mine who I knew, went to strip clubs or got lap dances or whatever. And talk about the fact that many of those women were likely trafficked. And it's something that people don't want to hear. And let me just say, like, I'm not, trying to throw just men under the bus. I mean, a lot of establishments within the United States, nail salons, massage parlors, many places have people who are trafficked, either sex trafficked or labor trafficked. And it's something that I wasn't even aware of. It wasn't until I got back from the Balkans that I realized, wow, human trafficking is not an issue that's unique to the Balkans or to impoverished countries. It's happening in the United States, right in our backyard. And so that's why I was drawn particularly to Deliver Fund. But I think it's one of those uncomfortable truths that many people just don't want to face, that, their participation, not just in massage parlors or strip clubs, but in the porn industry. There are many people who are trafficked or forced to work in the porn industry. And look, I'm no prude, I have no problem with consenting adults doing whatever they want, or the pornography industry, prostitution, any of it. But I think people use the civil liberties of whether they be people in adult entertainment business or prostitutes, arguing for those civil liberties as a way of kind of not having to look at the reality that many people involved in those industries are trafficked, are forced or coerced or manipulated into performing those services.
And again, there's so many things, interesting things that you were touched on. Yeah, I've spoken to many individuals in the adult entertainment field, and their big thing is consent and pushing that, and very high against anti-trafficking. And they acknowledge that we need to clean up stuff like that to make it a safe place for everyone. And I think that's kind of a thing like, why don't you? Because as you mentioned, you were surprised that it's happening here, and I think for the most part, it's not something people recognize or want to even admit could happen in the United States. Like, why do you think that is? Have you found something for Deliver Fund? Is there just not the information out there that labor trafficking is a big issue? Because that's something at Stop Now where we definitely focus on and try to shine a light on with some things that we're working on. So why do you think people don't want to face that?
I think part of it is, to be quite honest, is maybe a little bit of shame. It is horrifying to articulate that human slavery exists today, and it exists in the United States of America. And that's kind of a horrifying thought, because we've all, grown up in an era where slavery as we know it, or as we think of it as something of a horrible mar on American history from the past. So the recognition that it still exists today, and then the recognition that, wow, it still exists today in the United States, and these are the people who are cutting our nails or working in massage parlors, or horrible scenarios of children being sex trafficked online. I think that's part of it. So there's an element of shame, and then I think there's just an element of ignorance, like that couldn't happen in the United States. And there's also the assumption, and I, as a mother, would be the first to assume that could never happen to my kids. And one thing that I've seen as I learn more about the issue is how much the trafficking of minors, how the mass adoption of the smartphone, and the fact that our kids live online, live and breathe on social media, how much easier that's made it for individuals who would seek to manipulate and or traffic children.
Yeah, and is that so? You spoke about before how the CIA doesn't get involved in those issues. Are you aware of which bureaus are heavily involved in? I know the FBI gets involved in sting operations and arresting people, especially through online activity. Do you have any insight on how those operations work and how they gather data?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that's really shocking is, like, there's no kind of centralized organization that works solely on human trafficking. And another reason that I was so drawn to Deliver Fund, and one of the things that Deliver Fund does that hadn't really been done before, is we collect intelligence on traffickers, and we share that intelligence across many law enforcement jurisdictions, train, equip, and advise law enforcement on how to use that information. And so the intelligence that we're collecting is nationwide. Part of the problem with combating human trafficking is it really falls upon local law enforcement. Human trafficking cases are very difficult to prosecute. And aside from that, they just don't have the information. So one of the things that we're trying to do, and I think are doing quite successfully, is the same way that traffickers have scaled the problem of human trafficking, we're trying to scale the solution. So collecting that intelligence, providing it to law enforcement, training law enforcement how to use that intelligence, and then relaying information from one jurisdiction to another. One of the things about you don't have to be mobile to be trafficked or be a trafficker. Within the definition of trafficking, you don't actually have to move an individual, but you are forcing them to do something by manipulation or coercion. But traffickers often are mobile, and they will, move their product, which is human beings, across state lines. And so that, and go to different motels. And so that makes it, harder to prosecute, harder to track, harder to prosecute. Our technology that is tracking traffickers enables us to collect that information and share it across state lines and jurisdictions. It's one of these issues that I think, because I don't want to say that law enforcement has turned a blind eye to it. I don't think they necessarily have. I feel like law enforcement has not been well equipped with the resources, both the technology, the teams, and quite frankly, the money to be able to attack this problem. And the problem has grown, exponentially. As I said, the mass adoption of the smartphone, it used to be that a trafficker, if he wanted to traffic a young girl, he'd have to be someone in the neighborhood, or, maybe he'd see her at the mall. And that still happens, certainly. But now you have young girls posting online. And so the amount of time or effort it takes for a trafficker to recognize, oh, here's a young girl who's obviously feels alienated, or maybe she's fighting with her dad, she's mad at her dad, and she's posting about it. For that trafficker, who can pose as anyone online, there's a great New Yorker cartoon with two dogs in front of a laptop, and one saying to the other, on the internet nobody knows you're a dog. And well, that's true of traffickers. Now, our analysts have a way of identifying traffickers, infiltrating their networks, and, as I said, collecting intelligence on them. I forgot what your initial question was because I got so long-winded with my answer. But
Oh, no, no, that was a, yeah, actually, you did say something that also got my attention. Is that I was not aware that there wasn't any bureau that focused on trafficking. So does Deliver Fund work with local SBIs or local jurisdictions or police department? Who does the Deliver Fund go to to train and help with intel and in investigations in that case?
yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I mean, we do work with FBI, this certainly trafficking cases and money laundering, because every big trafficking case also has, a money laundering element to it. And sometimes that's the easiest part to prosecute. So we do work with the FBI, and we do work with local law enforcement. And a lot of times some places have a distinct trafficking task force that we can work with, and some don't. We've lent out Deliver Fund analysts to police departments to actually work within the police department, devoted that resource that we have to a police department so that they can help the police department combat trafficking in areas where there is really a high prevalence of human trafficking.
And is because that seems to be very detailed and complex. Is Deliver Fund, how many individuals do you have working, and do you work with all 50 states, or do you currently have a limitation?
We don't have any limit. What limits us most is lack of resources, lack of money. So, and that's where someone like me comes in. I don't work full time for Deliver Fund. This is a passion project of mine. So raising money and doing stuff like this, interviews, and educating the public about human trafficking and what Deliver Fund does is something that I do as a passion project of mine. But there's certainly no limit. We are absolutely willing to work with every state that's out there, federal law enforcement, DHS, anyone that wants to attack the issue of human trafficking and modern slavery and wants to get in the fight with us, we'll work with anyone.
So what are like some of the things that law enforcement needs to look for? Like because a lot of it is going to be digital, but that's not always the case. I know there was a campaign about someone tying like a ribbon around a woman's car door, and that is some kind of clue to other traffickers that she typically is alone and could be a victim. Are there things like that where law enforcement is aware of more, or that you can work with them to try to tell them the signs of what to look out for and how to stop it before it happens, instead of just being reactive to the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, or what we put an emphasis on, is using our technology, our infiltration of trafficker networks, and the way that we track them, and technology to give law enforcement an indication of where a known trafficker is in real time. I should go back, though, and say that one of the biggest struggles for law enforcement is that and not just law enforcement, but for prosecutors, as these are very difficult cases to prosecute. One of the reasons that we focus on getting traffickers off the street, because you get a trafficker off the street and you can potentially save countless victims. There are many organizations, which are very, well-meaning and fantastic organizations, that will work on, resources for victims once they've been saved. And this is something that's very important too. Our focus is more on getting at the root cause and getting known traffickers behind bars, and exposing them. We also have a program called the Thrivers program, where we help survivors really set themselves up and motivate survivors to have success and to not just survive and thrive. But that's a small additional component of what Deliver Fund does. Really, our focus is on getting law enforcement to be able to have that information that they don't have. Where are these traffickers? How are they operating? What are the signals, online, or as you pointed out, physical signals that there might be someone who's trafficked in the area?
And so, what do you think the public needs to, or what can the media do, or can the public do to bring more attention to this? Because it's, as you mentioned before, it's a far more prevalent than anyone wants to admit to, or think is possible. And what do you think can be done to help raise awareness for against the ending labor trafficking and sex trafficking?
Yeah. Number one, I think it's going to take education. And we have a real issue with our media, because our mainstream media is so politicized. It really detracts from the problem at hand. And the issue of child sex trafficking, and human trafficking can be co-opted by very fringe groups at extreme ends of the political spectrum. And that's something that I think very much is to the detriment of fighting the cause. This is not a political issue. This is not, it's not something Democrats do or Republicans do or Democrats are in favor of, or vice versa. And so I think one of the key things, this is something anybody in their right mind agrees is an evil. Let's take the enslaving another human being. If you believe in that, if you think that's an okay thing, then you're on our target list. But I do think raising awareness of how it happens. And one thing that I feel like I was early to the game that maybe many other parents are probably late to the game in realizing is, at the CIA, I was trained in manipulating people and recognizing people's vulnerabilities and exploiting those vulnerabilities and their motivations in order to get them to do something for me that might be against their best interests, which was commit espionage. So having been trained to do that, I can easily see how predators, and again, particularly online, but sometimes in person, sometimes physically, target vulnerable individuals for trafficking. We see this internationally. I mean, I'll take the case of Ukraine. And, when the war first started in Ukraine, you have women and children with nothing showing up at the border of Poland, and not having anywhere to go, not having any resources, and really in a desperate situation. Those are the kind of circumstances that are target rich for predators, sex and labor traffickers. And we have those circumstances here in the United States. It's not just war-torn Ukraine, or war beset Ukraine that has those kinds of issues. We have a terrible poverty epidemic here in the United States. And we have a terrible drug epidemic in the United States. And one of the things that traffickers do is, particularly if they're targeting young women or boys, they're looking for someone who's maybe estranged from their family, impoverished circumstances, depressed, or someone who's just reaching out. And that trafficker is going to recognize the vulnerabilities of their victim and prey upon those. And they will also, if a victim or a target is not already addicted to drugs, a trafficker will use drugs as a means of controlling their victim. Because once you have someone addicted to very powerful drugs that they can't get off of, they're going to do anything. So it makes it much easier to control them and coerce them. But traffickers use all kinds of tactics, exposure. I mean, a simple method online is traffickers will pose as someone else, and get young girl or sometimes boy, to send them pictures of them, in a compromising situation. They can pose as a 14-year-old boy, and the young girl thinks she's sending this to another boy her age, someone she's interested in. And then the trafficker will blackmail that victim. I'm going to show this to your priest. I'm going to show this to your parents. You've got to do this. You've got to do this. And young, impressionable people are scared. And this is just one of the many ways in which traffickers can entrap their victims. And I think one thing that's important to recognize is, although I said, obviously poverty makes people more vulnerable, this is a crime that really cuts across socioeconomic barriers. And it can happen to everyone. Not that should make it more or less important, but I think a lot of people think, oh, that would never happen to my kid. We're of means and my kid's relatively happy. There are some issues. No, it can happen to your kid. It does disproportionately affect particularly sex trafficking women and girls of color. And I think one thing that's also important is getting those communities involved in the fight, and really making the fight, like, as I said, this is not political. It cuts across socioeconomic barriers. And so getting more people educated about it and more people involved in trying to stop it. It's one of those things where there's such a clear delineation between good and evil. It's not controversial. Like either you're for slavery or you're not. And as I said, if you're for slavery, you're inhuman. So it is an issue that I think getting more and more people aware of and more people involved in stopping it.
Where do you think that education needs to come from? Because when there are issues with big corporations taking advantage of labor forces, and so and then would this come from the education system, or would this come from the government? Who, again, if that would come from a specific part, as you mentioned, it would be politicized heavily on mainstream. Like, where do you think that education needs to originate from?
Honestly, I think in the same way that now we have increasingly, more diversity, equity, and inclusion programs built into corporations, built into government entities, built into education. We need the same thing with trafficking, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And also, quite frankly, particularly with labor trafficking, like the education we do, it needs to be bilingual. We need to be communicating this in languages that are not just English, because some of the most vulnerable are immigrants or refugees who come to this country or end up in this country. But I think every organization and every branch of government should have built into their training trafficking awareness. I know that, when I do work on military contracts, the military has the U.S. Army has before. I think that in the same way that diversity, equity, and inclusion has become part and parcel of training and education for corporations and for governments, that we also need to have that same awareness and education about sex and labor trafficking, any form of human trafficking and global slavery. I know that when I work on a U.S. military contract, the military now has awareness training for all of its soldiers about sex and labor trafficking. And this is in part precisely because of the problem that I spoke of before, where a lot of military bases are in areas where establishments will pop up that cater to the soldiers who are there, and a lot of the women there are trafficked. Or in other cases, even U.S. contractors have used workers on bases or on contracts without realizing that they were trafficked. So an educational push across all fronts, whether it be military, all branches of U.S. government, private corporations, every organization should have an awareness of what the problem is, how it works, how there might be vulnerabilities within your own organization or to your own personnel, and what are the signs to look for of human trafficking and labor trafficking, and what to do when you find out about it. Where do you report that? There are, sex trafficking hotlines. Oftentimes, I don't know if it's the same for men, but certainly in the ladies' room at airports, there's always information on, if you are a victim of trafficking, please call this number, and it's in different languages. And all of that's very important. Although, as I said at the beginning, it's very, very hard to separate a trafficking victim from the person who's trafficking them, because they're usually in a situation where they're so exploited and controlled. But to answer your question, I do think just across all fronts, like a widespread and wide scale education push about this issue.
And yeah, I do think that would be very important. And Deliver Fund has a number of partners. Did you want to speak about them and how they help with the message and helping push the education out there to people that need to hear it?
Sure. I mean, I would say one of the organizations that we work closely with that's certainly worth highlighting is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is located in Alexandria, Virginia, but of course works globally. And this is an organization that's been around for a long time, but is probably one of the foremost nonprofits in educating. You think it's just about missing kids, but it's not. I mean, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, as it's known as, tracks cases of kids who have been trafficked. And, in the many missing kids are kids who have either run away from home or been, who are now under the control of someone who is trafficking them.
Are there typically a profile of who the kind of traffickers are? Are they typically come from a specific kind of mindset, or like a psychological profile of who they are? Because it seems like this has to be a very certain mindset to even go about wanting to do something like this.
Yeah, well, as I said, it is a crime that cuts across socioeconomic barriers, but, and I will say uniformly, I mean, for lack of a word, they're bad people. These are the bad guys that I've always wanted to fight. But they come in all shapes and sizes. So, there's no sense in kind of profiling an individual and thinking, that's the kind of person who would be a trafficker, unfortunately. But I will say this, and this is something that's very unfortunate. Yes, most traffickers at the top of the food chain are men. Most people who are trafficked are women. That's, certainly there are exceptions to that. And that's specific to sex trafficking. Unfortunately, some people, particularly women who get involved then in trafficking from the side of being the exploiter, it started out because they were trafficked themselves as minors. And sometimes the only way to get out of the most miserable circumstances that they are in is to then become a recruiter for the person who trafficked them. And, there's probably no more infamous case than you look at Ghislaine Maxwell and what she did for Jeffrey Epstein in roving around and finding victims for him. I don't know what and she's from a very, she and Jeffrey Epstein from very privileged classes. So, it's not just poor, desperate people trying to make ends meet that find trafficking to be a lucrative business. It's not just them drawn to it, and they're not those people are not the only victims either.
Yeah, and then I guess if there are parents watching or friends of individuals, like, are there warning signs that you could point out to see if someone is on the onset of being trafficked, or is there any kind of sign to try to help them get out of a situation before it's too late and they are moved from one place to another?
Certainly. I mean, I think there are signs, I'm a parent myself, and I know that, excuse me, any of my efforts to monitor my kids' social media, and I'm a former spy,
and I don't know what's going on in my kids' lives. So um, I'm not, I am not a real advocate of spying on your kids and monitoring every bit of their social media. Although I think that is certainly something that one can do. For me, it's more about educating my kids and talking to them. I can get a little obsessive about it. I have two boys, so on the one hand, they're at less of a risk than their female friends, but I'm always talking to my sons and their female friends about uh, safeguarding against making yourself appear vulnerable online. What do you share online? And when you're sharing something online, whether it be a picture of you upset and depressed, which people don't do a lot, or, a picture of you in like a skimpy top. And I don't want to get anywhere near victim blaming, but these are the kinds of things I talk to about my kids, that when you're doing that, you have to be aware that other people, it's not just your friends that might be looking at that there are predators out there. You have to have privacy settings on your social media so that not everybody can see what you're doing, and so that you don't easily make yourself a target of a predator. I also, however, firmly believe and have always believed, that we as women, young girls, we should be able to dress how we want, express ourselves how we want, um, and not be made the victims of crime or not be preyed upon. And so that's another reason why I really focus my energy in this fight on the aspect of getting these traffickers off the streets.
And if you could take some time to talk about Deliver Fund even more, and what people could do to help the organization, and what it is that you are looking for in the future to do and expand to help even more law enforcement across the country.
Sure. Deliver Fund is growing. Um, the main thing people can do, frankly, is go to deliverfund.org and donate. And it doesn't have to be a lot. If you have a lot, certainly donate a lot. But I hate to sound that simplistic, but the truth is we have the technology. What we really need are the resources to scale that technology. I believe that we, as an organization, we have a 100% conviction rate against traffickers for cases that have been prosecuted where we've brought that intelligence to law enforcement. So I believe we're on the right path to scaling the solution to this problem. And what money does for Deliver Fund is it gives us the capacity to make our technology better, to certainly add to our team and personnel, but to scale the technology and the tactics to a global level. And hopefully, starting out, our focus now is on the United States, although we do work globally, and this is a global problem. It's a problem without boundaries. So in our plans are to really scale those solutions beyond the United States globally, and to eradicate sex trafficking, to have and labor trafficking, but to have a day, and I do believe this day can happen, where we can say that slavery does not exist in the United States. Right now it does. It absolutely does.
And does Deliver Fund have any use for volunteers at all? Or is there any way people could volunteer to help out?
Certainly, we're always interested in talking to anyone who's interested in getting involved in the fight, whether that be young people, spreading the word within your community, or having educational settings. So again, go to deliverfund.org. If you can donate, and if not, check out our contact form, and get in touch. Yeah, join the fight.
Okay. And before we wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to add at all? Are you writing another book?
I I always have another book like at the back of my mind. I am working on something. It may or may not be fiction. It may or may not have to do with the intelligence community. But there will be a trafficking subplot to it. There will be so yeah, this is this issue, and I want to be clear that it's not just the sex trafficking, it's the notion of slavery and people being exploited in any way, shape, or form by another human being. The fact that it still exists in 2023, that it exists at such a vast scale, and that it's kind of endemic to the global economic system is something that irritates me at a fundamental level. So in terms of my own writing, I'm always writing. I'll have another book come out before I die. Let me put it that way.
Oh, that's definitely good to hear, and it was great talking to you. We would love to have you back again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Bye.